What is your worst college professor story? I didn't have this prof, but I tutored his students. It was a mess. The class was one of the most notoriously difficult required engineering courses to start. He never returned assignments, quizzes, or tests. He assigned a grade and you never saw your work again. So the students had no way of knowing what they were doing wrong. They were all mysteriously getting the exact same grades, too, despite sitting apart during exams. I had 5 of the 8 remaining students in the class in my tutoring sessions. He also couldn't work through his own examples and would give up halfway through. So these students had no idea what they were doing right or wrong. There were some very angry evaluations given at the end. Had a Latin professor who, whenever a student did not understand the question she was asking, in Latin, obviously, she would just stare at them and repeat the phrase over and over, as if saying it multiple times might make the student understand. When students told her they needed help or had a question, she simply refused to answer. I've never understood that. My high school Spanish teacher did the same thing, and once spent 30 minutes repeating a question to the entire class, a question that none of us knew the answer to. I'm late, but here it is. Had an art teacher in college. The first day of class he said, anyone who thinks we will be sitting here drawing and doodling may leave. This is to study art, not make it. Throughout the class he would remind everyone that he was an artist, had some paintings in our local museum, and that he knew pretty much everything about art. One day he told us our assignment was to go to the local museum, find one of his paintings, and critique it. What we liked, what we didn't, what mediums we thought he used versus what we would use. The general response after this assignment was, well, this is why you're not a professional artist, and I am. Another time we were looking at an unfinished painting by Picasso, I think. One girl raised her hand and asked, how can you be sure this is unfinished? He was extremely offended. How do I know? Do you realize who I am? Do you know what my profession is? It was awkward. A kid cheated on the exam in a 300-person class and the professor found out the day after the exam. He wouldn't let us leave the class until someone fessed up. We all sat there in silence until someone said they had to go to their next class. He threatened to kick her out of the class for the rest of the semester. We just all slowly got up and left since he couldn't force us to stay there. He was livid. No one confessed. I had a professor who, like many professors, made the class buy a textbook he wrote. However, his was not published. It was just 400 plus pages of his handwritten nonsense that had been Xeroxed. Next semester, mandatory sweet mixtape. One prof I had announces on the first day of class that 3/4s of us would fail. He then proceeded to teach the material so poorly and write exams so atrocious that 3/4s of us did indeed fail. I always have issue with professors who say this. More than half of you will fail. Well, maybe that's because we have a crappy teacher. It was a class that taught you about effective business communication. This was an 8 AM class that many students dreaded. Well, on multiple occasions, the class was cancelled, but the only way that was communicated was with a note outside the door. It takes me over an hour to commute to school. I would be absolutely livid. During my master's degree I was a TAFE or a geo professor who was a complete jerk. The first day of class he emailed me about 2 hours beforehand saying he couldn't make it so I would have to cover. Then he emailed me some scans of his crappy notes. After going over it for about an hour I decided to just do the best I could and to cover the course basics, timeline, description, etc. He was such a jerk he lectured me about how important first classes are when he got back, because I didn't go through some rudimentary definitions about geo is unreal. So then he got another TAFE to help out. This class was enormous, and he would only acknowledge that guy and just CC me on all the emails. I had no idea what this guy's problem was. The rest of that semester he would constantly criticize my presentations to the class. It was an entry-level class, so on this major class assignment, about 1/5 of the class didn't hand it in on time. He then accused me of losing papers for the class. So I sent out a mass email to all of the students' papers I was missing, warning them about their late submissions, which they all acknowledged, thereby proving to him how disinterested these students were in his class. He then proceeded to get to me single-handedly grade 250 plus essays in 3 days time because he was too busy. This was about a week before my deadline to submit my thesis proposal. When I did grade them, the few times a student ever brought up an issue, 4 in total, with maybe 1 legit, he always sided with the students and threw me under the bus. The next semester he was in charge of delegating TAs to different classes. He proceeded to put me in a field methods class from which I had no previous experience with, as if, just to spite me. I did end up enjoying that class a great deal, and the prof of that class was great, but wow, what an butthole. In my orbital dynamics class, we were tasked with writing a MATLAB code that would generate the classical orbital mechanics parameters based off some simple inputs. Given a velocity vector and altitude, find the period, orbital speed, eccentricity, etc. Since most people didn't know MATLAB, he provided the class with a finished code that worked, and told everyone they could use that as long as they wrote their own code for the graph plotting. I eschewed his code, wrote my own from scratch directly from the base derivations in the book, and then proceeded to plot my graphs on an overlay of the Earth so you could see the path of the satellite over the Earth's surface. Seemed a lot cooler than just white and a curve. Sucker gave me a 0 and wrote "I know what you did" in big red letters on the front. I went up and asked WTF dude. He says he knows I cheated. He knows I cheated because my graph was overlaid the Earth and not just a plain plot, and his code doesn't generate enough information to do that. I told him I wrote my own code from the book, showed him my timestamped commentary in my code from when I wrote it, and I showed him how I had helped several other students get their non-working plot codes to at least plot. He still claimed I cheated. I went to the dean. She chalked up his behavior to old school Chinese culture and then said she would have the other dean grade it for impartiality. He flipped and threatened to dock my grade if I ever complained again to the dean, but the fricking idiot wrote it in an email to me. So I forwarded that sucker to the deans. The son of a bee claimed I lied and doctored the email, as well as cheated on the assignment. Well, since he doubled down on his bulls, both deans fully investigated me, my work, and then interviewed people from the class who unbeknownst to me had already come in to complain about their own issues and the fact that he had very openly had outbursts in class directed at me for having complained about him. Ultimately, he wasn't allowed to have say in anyone's final grade. His syllabus was thrown out, and I got an A in his class. Frick him so hard, but I won. Flawless victory. I had a college professor teaching genetic algorithms that from my perspective was a genius, but socially awkward. Or so I thought. At the end of the first semester he gave us a genetic algorithm that he'd written spanning about 20 pages that didn't work and had numerous mistakes in it. These were part of the test of locating these errors and getting the program to spit out sunspot calculations. I approached him in his room and asked if I could go over the program briefly. He told me that he was on his way out but to follow me and we could talk about it. Just after he was done doing what he had to do, I dutifully followed him out the room, down the long corridor, downstairs 2 flights, along that corridor where he briefly looked at every door, up 1 flight of stairs and back along another corridor, where again he briefly looked at almost every door before trying one. All the time he looked slightly off key. We got to the end of that corridor, before climbing another flight of stairs to the floor of his room. Again he briefly looked and paused at every door, before getting to his own. When he stuck the key in his door, he looked at me and for the first time since we left his room he spoke, asking, "Are you following me?" Was commuting to school daily. One morning we had a test. On the drive there, I hit a deer and my vehicle was undrivable. I took pictures with my phone and sent her an email from the side of the road while waiting on a ride. She said that hitting the deer was an unexcused absence from class and I failed a test worth 30% of the grade. That made me fail the course. She said, and I quote, "Deer are something you should account for when you leave in the morning. Leave enough time to deal with traffic inconveniences." I live in SoCal, so always leave for work 3 hours early in case there is a sharknado. I was in an engineering physics class in college. It was 30 guys and 2 girls, me, and the girl who sat next to me. Our professor was an older Asian dude with the absolute worst accent I have ever had in a teacher. The entire class could barely understand him. Usually, class would just be an hour of lesson, then 2 hours of working on homework or projects. 3-hour class 2 times a week. The girl who sat next to me went to a tutor, and we shared notes and things and kept up low B averages in the class, which put us in the higher grade range of the class average. So one day, there's a problem we're stuck on. Her tutor's notes aren't helping much, so we ask our professor for help. He is a massive butthole, and starts freaking out when he learns she goes to a tutor. He's talking loudly so the class can hear and says women always do poorly in my class. You should pick a more appropriate major for yourselves, like something in elementary education. The other girl was super offended. She reported him to the department head, and a few days later he made the announcement that he was tenured, and can say whatever he likes to us without fear of being fired. Frick that guy. I hate him to this day, 4 years later. Thermodynamics 2. I was working 3 times as hard in this class as the rest of my classes combined. First test comes and I absolutely nailed it. Real confident in my work. Test scores come back and I made a 68. Upon investigation, I realized I had gotten every single answer correct. However, I did not use the correct method for solving these problems. You see, this professor wrote the textbook and was convinced his method was the only correct method as defined in our textbook. However, in Thermodynamics 1 I had learned a different, easier method. I got penalized for not taking this professor's Thermo 1 class. Take it up with the dean or the head of his department, dude. Common theme in this thread is, professor did something wrong but I chose not to do anything. University of Michigan has little to no student rights regarding family deaths. Grandmother was passing away but within travel distance. I was close with her, made a request to delay an assignment by 1 or 2 days to be with her when she passed. This was a partner project, meaning if I skipped it, I would have been screwing over the partner since it was worth something like 25% of the course grade. Professor denied the request saying she doesn't count as immediate family and would be unfair. Grandmother passed away the night of prepping for turning an assignment, meaning I could have been with her. My mom and the rest of the family had the professor granted the request. It has been several years now and I still get upset thinking about it. Miserable professor and human being. If you were late to class, don't show up. That's what he told us the first week. One kid showed up 2 minutes late for an exam and the professor made him stand in the front of the class and humiliated the kid for 10 minutes. Told him to drop the class and never show up again. We were in shock. My Diff Ec 2 prof spoke almost no English. We had to communicate with him entirely in the language of mathematics. Like, if you had a question, you had to write an equation on the blackboard with a question mark over the equal sign, and then he would write an equation attempting to explain why your equation was or wasn't correct. I know that is incredibly frustrating, but I think it's cool that certain things can be communicated without language. I've always felt that way about music. People from all over the world can get together and play in a symphony as long as they can read music. So cool. I had to take this crappy English class in community college that was pretty much just a middle school level creative writing class. The professor was known for not giving anyone an A on anything ever. I wrote a kickbutt paper and was quite proud of it and sure I would get an A. When I got it back, I could see where she had scored each section so that it added up to over a 90%. Realized her mistake. Then went back and wiped it out and changed a few of my individual scores to make it add up to a B. I'm still angry about it and that was 15 years ago. I had a children's literature class in second year. It was on a Saturday at 8 AM and the teacher would have us read a book a week. The books were actually pretty good, but during class she would just talk for 3 hours about how important the religious values were that the book was teaching. She took every single kid's book and basically made it a sermon even though her points were bat crap crazy. Whenever someone expressed a different opinion than her, she would ask them their name and then tell them to get out of her classroom. On the subsequent assignment, because it was fairly opinion based, they could count on a failing grade even if it was perfectly written and they were right in their assessment. A couple people in my class ended up passing the course by going to the department with all of their assignments and complaining. She didn't work there the next year. She didn't work there the next year. Good. My speech public speaking professor, senior year, showed up massively hungover or high just about every class. Would literally lie down on a desk and lecture talking up to the ceiling. Pulled me aside at the end of the semester and warned me, in a very serious tone, that I should never pursue a career that would involve public speaking since I was so obviously awful at it. I think about that every semester before I greet my new students. Rickety wrecked son. Physics professor teaching lab was fairly normal. He would occasionally get bored and give us life advice, especially trying to get us interested in geophysics, especially with regards to the petroleum industry. One day he kind of hints that his parents were terminally ill. Cut to a week later, he has a nervous breakdown in lab. He proceeds to tell us that he doesn't care if we finish the lab, but he will grade it for those who stick around. So those of us that cared about our grades stuck around. He then gave the saddest recounting of his life story, going into serious detail. At this point I felt like I needed to stick around to both finish lab but to make sure that he was okay. He informed us that while working for Exxon he was making serious money, was happy, but then his ex-wife was having sex with his friends, so he quit and divorced her. This guy's life was seriously miserable. He informed us that his parents both had terminal cancer and his new wife left him very recently, which brought us up to the breakdown day. This monologue was just about 3 hours long, and in conclusion he tells us you guys need to know how to distinguish signal to noise. Signal to noise. The next week I was dreading that this would happen again, but he disappeared. No notice to the school, no notice to his friends. Our grades were adjusted based on the 3 remaining labs because he hadn't handed anything back and they could not get a hold of him. Our professor knew nothing about our program. One of our projects was to make a group and make a game. He said that using an engine like Unreal was cheating because it wasn't made by us. After he finally loosened up about that, he wanted a signed note from our teachers proving that these engines actually exist because he was too lazy to research himself. When we all tried to hand in our first project, he rejected them all because they weren't professional. He never outlined he wanted it formatted in any way. The next year he was teaching another class. He called one of the students retarded, just assumed what they did was wrong, and when someone who had been in a serious accident and had a note to rewrite an exam refused to allow him to write it because the school may allow notes, but I don't. For me, it's easily my physics I professor. I had a saying that I used to tout about this teacher, who we'll call BC. BC couldn't teach a student physics to save his life, even if Satan himself were calling his name. Why was he so bad, you ask? He didn't know how to explain the problems. He'd reached that understanding of physics where he was so high up that he was no longer to effectively explain how to solve basic problems. He'd explain step 1, then step 2, then step 5, because to him steps 3 and 4 were so rudimentary. If you asked him about steps 3 and 4, he'd say because that's the way it works. In response, his lectures were pretty disorganized in that he'd jump from formula to formula. That is, he'd start explaining what velocity was, then explain how knowing acceleration only could allow you to determine distance traveled without finishing his explanation of velocity. It was almost impossible to make sense of what he was saying. The textbook he'd selected also sucked at explaining physics. He had a voice that could put a raging orc to sleep. The worst part about him though was that he was a nice guy. He really, truly, genuinely was trying to get through to us and had no idea how. Every test the average curve was 40 points, and it would have been higher if not for the fact that some students in the class had already taken physics, and though he tried and tried again to make us get it, he simply couldn't. That's the worst. It's easy to hate on a professor who is terrible and a jerk about it, but it is much worse when your professor is terrible, but trying like heck to make it work. Then you just feel bad and wish him luck improving. The first college I went to was small. They had a lot of crap I didn't like, but one kind of cool thing was their class registration system. Since it was such a small school, instead of registering for everything months ahead of time, you spend 3 days a week before the semester began going around and talking to professors who taught courses you were interested in. You scheduled 10-15 minute interviews with them in their office. My freshman year I saw an intro to Shakespeare class, and since I liked most of what I've read of Shakespeare, I figured it could be fun. I interviewed the professor, a very short man named Kaiser, and he was pleasant for most of the interview. He explained the class and then opened up for questions. One thing he mentioned was that plays were in different categories, such as comedies, romances, and dramas. I asked him what plays we'd be reading, and he listed The Tempest as one of the romances. I figured I wanted to take the class and thought it'd be cool to engage in some dialogue with my future professor. So I told him that I thought it was interesting, since we had studied The Tempest as a comedy when I was in high school. The mood died instantly. He first asked me very seriously what I meant, and when I started to explain, he exploded. He started screaming about how I was wrong and how could I possibly think The Tempest was a comedy, and just started ranting. I was too astounded by this tiny man just freaking out at me and wasn't really registering a lot of what he said, but I ultimately did not register for his course. Later I was telling the story to some sophomore students and told the story without saying the teacher's name. When they asked me who it was, I told them Kaiser, and they all just nodded knowingly. TLDR. Got accosted by a dwarf over an innocent question about Shakespeare. When I think Shakespeare, I still think of my high school English teacher and his concise genre categorization. Tragedy, everybody dies at the end. Comedy, everybody gets married at the end. It was a pretty spot on overview. This old history professor was trying to prove a point one day and asked someone to name a stereotype. Any stereotype. You didn't have to believe it, just one you'd heard before. He started getting pee after a minute or two with no one raising their hand. So I did and said, Jewish people are good with money. Oh ho, so why is Israel so poor then? He replied all haughtily. I raised my hand again. I just studied Israel the semester before in a Middle Eastern history class. It's not. It's in the top 20-25 in the world in GDP. And this mother-s response. I don't need to be lectured by a racist. I think your response should have been funny. That's what I was about to say. I had a professor who would literally accuse the whole class of being on drugs. He couldn't teach worth a crap and constantly whined about how we were comatose. In retrospect, I should have just walked out in the middle of one of his rants and gone straight to the dean. This was an upper level engineering course. That's a steep accusation to make to a room full of adults who were there to learn from him. You should have. I wrote a 20-page case study for a childhood development course. She told me it was too general and not detailed enough. My next case study was 40 pages. She only graded the front and last page. Had this young cocky math professor who spent about half of our hour-long lectures talking about his recent college days and baseball and random butt riddles. Was fun for a while, but I think it was a ploy to cover up the fact that he couldn't math. Seriously, whenever he would try to explain something he would have to read it directly from our textbook, and he refused to answer questions. I will never forget how many times he was doing problems on the board and would forget how to do them midway through. I really don't care about most quirks that professors have, but not knowing how to do what you're going to test us on is a huge no-no. He is the only professor I've ever disliked. I had a biology class that I got a B+ in the first semester. Second semester, I got a D. I did not understand how that had happened, as I did well on tests but kept getting terrible grades on written work. The bio professor and I were, I thought, on good terms and he knew I wanted to minor. 2 years later, the douchebag I had been dating that year told me he went into the bio professor's office and saw the stack of papers he was grading from our class. He asked if the professor knew who I was and the professor stated he did. Douchebag then proceeded to tell our professor our entire relationship and his skewed view of how I screwed him over, ending with how the professor should fail me because I'm a B. Douchebag thought it was hilarious that he had apparently listened and almost failed me. Professors should not get involved in students' relationship drama. That's awful. If that's the reason the guy almost failed you, he should be sacked. My marketing research professor said she didn't put any weight on the negative, big constructive criticism she received as part of teacher evaluations because she didn't trust surveys. Marketing research professor, doesn't trust surveys. Dealing with 2 this semester, my Native American history teacher called me out for using passive voice in one sentence on a pop quiz. I was actively taking away agency from Native peoples. On top of that, my faculty advisor is flaky as heck and never responds to emails. So I've never met this woman, but I need her to register for classes next semester, most of which are already filled up because she won't make a freaking appointment with me so I can lift the hold on my account. I have an advisor similar to yours. I found a way to get her to respond that's incredibly ridiculous. My department has 2 advisors, so I email the other advisor a question, and she forwards it to my advisor saying, hey, this kid is yours, and then I get a reply within 20 minutes. Otherwise I'm waiting a month to get a reply. This isn't as terrible as it was awkward for the professor. I was in this anthropology course my freshman year where the professor was an actual anthropologist who was extremely passionate about his work. He spent about 60% of the class talking about his trips and time with local Fiji tribes and his experiences. That wasn't too bad. It started to get bad when he started reenacting their rituals in front of the whole lecture hall. A class of about 150. Men looked very silly and awkward. For instance, there was one dance he did where he was basically squatted like a chicken and went in circles squawking. He would do them with so much passion and was just into it 110%. Many of us were silent in our seats like WTF, and a few brave souls laughed at him out loud, which led to him promptly stopping and singling those students out, asking them if they had anything to contribute to the course. Most of the time they said no, and he would abruptly continue with, well then shut up. Hilarious times. I got a C in that course, so frick that guy. I've never met a sane anthropologist. In one of my marketing 300 level classes, our professor was terrible at teaching. We were having an exam review and nobody in the class understood the material. We asked if we could push the test back at least one class because we didn't understand. He said absolutely not. I took the test, and I finished it in 30 minutes. You all should be able to do it if I can do it. We ended up going to the head of the department after that class and we got it moved back a week. 70% of the class still failed that exam. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.